All right, Rev students. Well, it's good to be speaking to you guys this week. Erin spoke last week, and she did a great job. Everyone give it up for Erin. Yeah, she's not here this week to hear your applause, but I'll tell her that it was brief and light. No, she did a great job. Yeah, there is some more clapping. Still brief and very quiet. But still better than the clapping. Okay, here we go. Yeah, go Erin. She can hear this all the way from her house. But it was great. It was a week 2 in our series. We're now jumping into week 3. We've been studying the book of Philippians, and so you should have some Bibles around you. We're going to be at the end of Philippians chapter 1, so we're not quite out of chapter 1 yet. As we're going through this series, we're not necessarily going verse by verse, but kind of taking some main themes and some main parts of it and looking at that together. And so this will be our last week. In week 1, really setting the pace of where we're going, and then we're going to start jumping through it real fast over the next couple of weeks. And summer's almost over. You know, are any of you sad about that? No one's sad? Some of you sad? Yeah, summer's almost over. And so, but we have some work to do today to finish up chapter 1, and I'm really excited about it. And so for us, I want to recap where we've been just so you can follow along. In week 1, we opened up talking about the very first couple of verses where Paul was talking about our identity in Christ, that we have a new identity now as believers, that our identity's been changed. We are now slaves to Christ, and that's not a negative connotation. That is a beautiful and wonderful thing. That means we have the greatest allegiance to the greatest person who has ever existed because we have a new master who has freed us and wants what's best for us and gives us everything that we need. And then last week, Erin picked up from there and talked about how we have a God who is for us in the midst of hardship, in the midst of difficulty, that God is for us and He is with us in every single way. And we saw that in Paul's life as Paul is sitting in a prison cell and he's writing to his friends. And he even has some people from this church in Philippi that's coming to visit him in prison. And you see this relationship being talked about. Where it's very kind and very tender. It's almost like pen pals or, like a friend you haven't seen in a long time. Does everyone have that friend? Maybe it's like a cousin you don't see a lot, or maybe it's like a friend we used to go to school with, but when you see each other, maybe it's once or twice a year, it's like no time has passed. You're immediately best friends again. That's almost the kind of feeling that you're getting here from the way Paul's writing. He's like, hey, I love you guys. I care about you guys. I want what's best for you guys. I'm so thankful for you guys. And right here, we're going to see his tone shift a little bit. Right here, where we're going today, kind of the end of chapter 1, his tone shifts and he begins to give some instruction. He's still saying, hey, I love you. I still care about you. I still want what's best for you. But for all of those things to be true and for that to happen, there's some things I want to remind you of. And so as we break that down, I began to think as I was looking at where we're going and what we're looking at today, he's going to be giving us some measurements to see how we match up in our relationship to Jesus. And you know what would be my measurements? Has any of you ever measured anything before? No one? Wow. I have a tape measure right here. Has anyone ever used one of these before? Yeah, okay, great. And so it's really great. You can measure things. Like if I wanted to know how big my smile is, I could sit here and I could measure it. I could say, hey, I actually couldn't read it because I was, as soon as I moved it away from my mouth, I couldn't see it. But if I wanted to find how far I am away from Aiden right here, we're going to find it out, Aiden. Hold on. Aiden, we're about 7 feet from each other, okay? So you could use it to measure things. It helps to measure distance. I have a definition for you here about measurements. It's to estimate or assess the extent, quality, value, or effect of something. And so I do a lot of house projects around my house. We've renovated some bathrooms, renovated some bedrooms. We have some more stuff going on. And usually when we kind of get started, we kind of have a blueprint that we're working off of. It's saying, hey, this wall is going to be 10 feet long, right? And so we measure it out and we make sure that it's 10 feet. Because you know what happens if we say this wall is supposed to be 10 feet long, but we only cut the wood 9 feet long, you know what's going to happen? we're going to have a really janky wall, all right? It is not going to serve the purpose that it needs to. It's not going to do the things. There's going to be like a hole here. It's not going to be great. The measurement is important for us to get to where we're going. And in the same way, Paul is going to be pointing out some measurements. He's saying, hey, Jesus has given us a blueprint. He has marked out some measurements for us for what it looks like to live like Jesus did, what it looks like to love like Jesus did, what it looks like to serve people like Jesus did. And he's given us some measurements on what that looks like in our blueprint. And we're supposed to take our tape measures and say, hey, does it match up to what he has done? But Paul's going to say it like this in Philippians chapter 1, verse 27. He says, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. A couple of things here. That word only means, it means the only one, or no matter what. And so it's saying, hey, no matter what happens in your life, no matter what situation's going on, no matter, especially in Paul's context, no matter what difficulty you're facing, no matter what's convenient or inconvenient, no matter what's popular or not popular, the only thing that you are needing to be worried about, the only thing that your focus should be on, the measurement that we're trying to match up to is that our lives would be worthy of the gospel of Christ. And so he begins to break down that measurement and say, he gives us some instruction. Hey, you want to see how wide this is? You want to see how long this is supposed to be? You want to see how tall this is? This is what that looks like. He begins giving us some details. He continues in verse 27. He says, so whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for faith in the gospel. He says standing firm, striving side by side. In that time period, these would have been associated with military terms. To stand side by side would have created a picture of an unbreakable wall that as you stood side by side with your brothers, as you stood side by side with your fellow warriors, that you would be creating a wall that could not be broken down, that there is a defense. Things could not get past you. And then it says striving with one mind. Striving side by side, that you guys together with the same purpose, the same direction, are going after something. And so he's using this military terminology, but for us, for our terminology, for where Paul is taking this when it comes to us, we have to realize that we also have an enemy. And that if we are not striving side by side, if we are not standing firm, if we're giving up ground, that means that our enemy is winning, that our enemy is gaining territory. And that's a big deal for us. It was a big deal for Paul. And the whole theme for this series, and really the whole theme for Philippians that Paul has been discussing, is this idea of unity. And he's addressing it in a ton of different areas. In the beginning of the first chapter, he addressed it personally. He talks about the unity that he had with his fellow brothers and sisters, and it was very personal. And he's talking about how they cared for each other, and they visited each other when they were in trouble and suffering in prison. And now he's talking about it in a broader sense. Hey, what it looks like for us to be unified is that we would be standing side by side, giving up no ground. That we would be striving together for the same goal, fighting for the same thing. And the reality is that there's a danger here that he's communicating, that we have an enemy that does not want us to have unity. We have an enemy that wants us to be more focused fighting with each other than fighting against him. And so we have to begin to ask ourselves some evaluative questions. Hey, is our unity in a way that's worthy of the gospel? Is the way that we're loving each other a way that's worthy of the gospel? Is the way that we serve each other a way that's worthy of the gospel? He begins giving some measurements. Hey, is it this wide? Is it this long? Is it this tall? He's giving us some identifiers for us to figure out. Hey, where do we match up? Are we off the blueprint that he has given us? He's saying, hey, if the gospel has changed your identity, and we said, hey, we have a new identity now. We have a new master. We have new citizenship. We're a part of a new kingdom. Our identity has been changed. He said that should affect the way that we treat each other. You know, we just celebrated the 4th of July, and I'm not sure how big you celebrate the 4th of July. Some people are like way up here, and then some people are like, you know, it happens every year. It's not a big deal. I don't get any gifts. Hey, it's not my favorite one of the holidays. We had a great time celebrating 4th of July. It's actually my sister-in-law's birthday. We spent really the last 2 days hanging out with family. And so there's about 11 grandkids across our kind of immediate family on my wife's side. And so it's a lot of kids running around, a lot of craziness. We went out on the lake yesterday. It was super great. We took Whit out on his first boat ride. I have some pictures of him here, the cutest little kid in the cutest little life jacket you ever did see. You know, the life jacket's holding up his cute little cheeks. And so we have a video. As soon as the boat took off, he just threw his hand up. No prompting. No one had to teach him how to do it. He just knew when things go fast, my hands go up, I get excited. And so it was an awesome just first experience for us and our family. And we celebrated. We grilled out burgers. We had some great steak. We celebrated our sister, but we also celebrated the freedom we have in our country. And that's something that's good. And that's something that should be celebrated. You know why? We have an identity with our country. That's something we should celebrate. The fact that we can gather in this place and talk about Jesus openly without persecution, without fear of danger or harm coming to us, is a freedom that not every country has. We should celebrate the freedom that we have. We have an identity. We have a citizenship with our country. And there's other identities we have. We have identities with our families. We have identities with our job. But the point that Paul is communicating here is we have a greater citizenship. We have a greater identity in Christ. And as much as we should celebrate the United States of America, Jesus should be celebrated that much more. And as much as we identify with our own family, and as much as we identify with our friends or groups that we are in, we should identify as believers and brothers and sisters in Christ that much more. He says we have a new identity. And listen, what our enemy wants to do is to get us to forget that we have a new identity. Because when we forget that we have a new identity, we forget who we really are to each other. We forget the love that we're supposed to have with one another. We forget what it looks like to be forgiven and then extend that forgiveness to others. We forget what it feels like to be humble and to serve someone else, even when it doesn't benefit us at all. We forget who we are. We forget about our new kingdom. We forget about our new master when we forget our identity, and that is what the enemy wants to do. You see, our identity is greater than our enemy. Our identity is greater than our enemy. Paul continues and talks about this in the next verse, Philippians 1:28. He says, "And not frightened in anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God." Again, he's continuing this idea, talking about our identity and what unity looks like. When believers are gathered together, when believers are standing firm side by side, they're not giving up any ground. The enemy can't get past. When believers are striving side by side, going after the same goal, the same mission, lifting up Jesus as the only name that is worth celebrating and lifting up. He says that the enemy has no options. The enemy is reminded of his destruction. He has already been defeated. You see, when we are operating in our identities, it doesn't matter what the enemy throws at us because he's already lost. So I don't know what your current circumstances is. I'm not sure what the current difficulty in your life is, the frustration, the things that makes anxiety rise and makes you feel weighed down. But what I can tell you is when the enemy tries to throw that at you, when you remember your identity, you remember that the master that you serve has already won the battle. Victory is secure. Eternity is secure. He says it not only reminds them of their destruction, but it reminds you of your salvation. You see, when when we also remember our identity. We remember that our eternity is secure, our hope is secure, our faith is secure, because what Jesus did was once and for all. The work is finished. Jesus sat down, said, "It is finished. The work is done. The work that I did, that I purchased by my blood, is sufficient. And it is available to every single one of you." So again here, he's giving us some measurements. There's some dangers that he's pointing out. Hey, I need you guys to be careful. I care about you guys. You guys are my friends. You guys are my family. You need to be careful because there's some dangerments. Jesus has given us some measurements that we need to watch out for. You see, in the most destructive thing to the cause of Christ and the life that he has purchased for us is when disunity emerges. When the church gets so focused on fighting over things that they forget to fight the mission of the gospel. When things that happen in this room take precedent and we forget that there's lost people with the eternal destination of hell that we are supposed to be fighting for and pleading for. There's some churches, and we belong to a really great church. There are some churches that are more worried about what color the carpet is than lost people going to hell. He's saying, hey, we need to remember what's most important here. You see, the way that we stand united with each other shows our unity with Christ. You see, it's not just about us being unified. That's a means to the purpose, but that's not just the purpose. When we're unified with each other, that means that the world sees us unified with Jesus. Hey, how could all of these people get together with all of their differences and all of their different personalities and all of their different passions? And how could they get together and say, hey, there is one thing worth lifting up and one thing worth celebrating and one thing that is most important? Because that's something I need to know about. Paul continues. He's not done yet. He has one more thing he wants to talk to us about, specifically with our unity. He says, "For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake, engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had and now hear that I still have." This word granted here is also translated as the word gifted. He's saying it has been gifted to you to suffer for the sake of Christ. Last week, if you were here, Aaron taught a little bit out of the Message translation. I think it's a really good tool, and I love actually the way that they translated this part. It's not going to be up on the screens. I just want you to hear it. He says, "There is far more to this life than trusting in Christ. There's also suffering for him, and the suffering is as much a gift as the trusting." And that's not something that we like talking about. That's not something that that's not something that we're signing up for. Like, hey, you know what? I want to follow Jesus. I want to spend forever with him, and I really want to suffer a lot. Like, that's not, I don't remember that application being passed out at the church service when I first started hearing about Jesus. And for me, as I've learned, as I've experienced suffering in my life, when I hear suffering as a gift, sometimes I'm wondering if there's a gift receipt. Like, am I able to return it? Is there like a policy on this? And that's just my honest feeling sometimes. I don't want to experience that. If he's saying it's good for me, I'm wondering, how is it good for me? And what I believe we begin to see is the way that we navigate through our suffering tells a story. That's what we saw in Paul's life. Aaron talked about it last week. Paul is sitting in a prison cell awaiting execution, probably sick, hasn't been fed well, beaten regularly, disconnected from his friends, disconnected from his family, and he's sitting there. He's like, hey, you know what? If I continue to live, that means I continue to tell people about Jesus. That's a win in my book. But if they go ahead and kill me, that means I get to be with Jesus. That's also a win in my book. So I have win-win scenarios everywhere I look. And when you have that mentality, that tells a story about a God who is greater than your situation. that tells a story about a God who is bigger than the things going on around you, that tells about a story about a God who offers hope, who offers life, a God who you can trust in. And so my question for you is, when it comes to how you navigate the suffering in your life, what kind of story is it telling? He says, I've given you a gift to suffer, and the purpose is that actually makes us, we see that in a couple of places of Scripture, that actually makes us more like Jesus as we walk through difficulty and we respond to who Jesus is and what he's done with us. Not only does that make us more like him, but it draws us closer to him. And so that's why he said, hey, this is good for you. It pulls your hands off of the things around you and it pulls you closer to me. That is the best thing that could happen to you. But it is going to be hard. It is going to be difficult. What kind of story are you telling? I remember growing up and, when I would get in trouble, which was a lot, unfortunately, my dad would always offer me a couple of different options. And so usually it involved like, hey, some type of lighter punishment, but I had to experience it right now. Or I could choose maybe a more lengthy punishment. So it might be like, hey, you're going to get a spanking right now, or you can be grounded from TV for the rest of the week, right? And so then I had to make a decision. Like conflict began to stir up inside of me. I'm wondering, be like, hey, I really don't want to get a spanking, that hurts. But I'm really into this show right now, and it comes on Thursday, and if I don't watch it, I'm going to miss out on my show. Which one hurts worse? And so I began to have to navigate those things at a young age. It was very hard to figure out, and most of the time, I would just choose, hey, just give me the spanking now, because for me, the quick suffering right now wasn't as bad as suffering over a long period of time. I feel like most people would agree to that. And I feel like that happens so many times in our relationship with Jesus, where people would say, hey, I love Jesus, I'm willing to follow Jesus, I would die for Jesus. Yet when Jesus has asked you to live for him and die to yourself, you're saying, hey, but that's really hard. I don't want to give up these things. You mean for me to follow you, I might have to give up on some things that I see other people around me having? Now, I'm not sure if I want it that much. You mean for me to follow you, that means I have to deny certain desires or certain passions that I have? I mean, that sounds really hard. You mean I have to continue doing that for the rest of my life? I'm not sure if I want all of that. And he's asking, hey, would you be willing to endure suffering? Maybe tomorrow, maybe a week from now, maybe a year from now, maybe 4 years, long periods of time. Would you be willing to fight for unity even when it's difficult, even when it's inconvenient, even when maybe it doesn't make sense? Because the gospel is at stake and we have been called to live in a way that is worthy of all that Jesus has done for us. Paul talks in Romans chapter 12, verse 1. He's really pleading with the church at Rome. He says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by the testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and pleasing. Like I said, some people, for them, it would just be easier to say, hey, if it's up to me, I'd rather just die for Jesus. And I'm not trying to make that light. There are people that have given their lives for Jesus, that have gone on mission to other countries and sacrificed their life for Jesus. And the reason that they got to that point is because that they were willing to deny things in their own life. They were willing to sacrifice their family, their time with their family. They were willing to sacrifice their future careers. They were willing to sacrifice the worldly things around them that everyone else was pursuing and everyone else was doing just to pursue Jesus. So I'm not trying to make light of that. But I believe we can fall into this mentality that says, hey, if the rubber met the road, I would die for Jesus, but I'm not actually willing to live for him. He says, hey, what Paul is saying here is the way that you live your life is worship. The way that you live your life is telling a story about who God is. What story is it telling? Is your God a good God who is for you? Is your God a God who has freed you? Is your God a God who has saved you? Or is he just someone that you hang out with once a week? Is he someone that you just like hearing about because it makes you feel good about yourself? Paul's switch in the book of Philippians in verse 27, his challenge, his command, for me is probably one of my life verses. Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. That as you look and as you evaluate your life and you see who Jesus is and what Jesus has done, and you look at the cross and you say, hey, what are the things that I'm worried about in my life? And does that make sense based off of everything that Jesus has done for me? As you pull out your measurement tool, whatever it is, and you're looking and you're evaluating and you're saying, hey, when it comes to how I treat people, does it match up to the way Jesus lived his life, the blueprint that he set for me? As it comes to the way that I sacrifice my needs, my desires, whatever that is, for the gospel of Christ, does it match up to the way that Jesus sacrificed? As it comes to the way that I plan out my future, am I more worried about getting what's most for me or most for my new master and his new kingdom? Where is our measurement at? My last point for you today is this. Don't waste your life living for anything other than Jesus. Paul's plea there where he says only, no matter what, the only thing when you get to the end of your life, and this is really where Paul is when he's writing this in Philippians. He's at the end of his life. We can know through church history that he's probably within the last couple of years of his life sitting in a Roman prison, and he's thinking, what's next for me? And he's thinking, hey, I don't know how much time I have left. They could finish my prison sentence tomorrow. What is most important? You hear people tell stories of like near-death experiences, and as they do that it puts things in perspective for them. That as they get into this experience where they had to evaluate their life and evaluate possible impending doom, that they began to realize a lot of the things that they spent their time doing, and a lot of the things that they spent their energy on, and a lot of the things that their life told a story about that was great, wasn't that great after all. And Paul's saying when you get to the end of your life, whenever that is, if you live a life telling a story about a good God who sent his only son to live and die for you, and who rose again and who is living and reigning and reconciling all things to himself, and who wants what's best for you, who has a better future for you than you could plan for yourself, who wants what's best for you when you only know what you want. When your life tells a story about that God, you don't get to your end of your life and be like, you know what, I wish I would have made more money. You don't get to the end of your life and said, I wish I would have just had more things. You don't get to the end of your life as I wish I would have spent more time on all the stuff around me. You get to the end of your life and say, man, I focused on the only thing that matters. My new master, my new identity, my new citizenship. And that's what we saw in Paul's life. As he's nearing the end and he's writing to the people who are closest to him, he says, no matter what, the most important thing is that when you pull out the tape measure of your life and begin to evaluate where you measure up, man, are you living in a manner worthy of all that Jesus has done? What story is your life telling? Who is being lifted up? Pray with me.